This is Ring to Front, a podcast about design, work, and life by the Toronto Design Directory. I'm your host, Margot Trudell, and today I'm talking to Jamie Chang, a typeface designer who learned their craft in New York and The Hague, honed it in the UK and Toronto, and now runs their own font foundry called Manic Type. We're going to get into the nuances of type design, running a business in this industry, and what he thinks the future of type might look like. Let's go say hi. Hey, Jamie. Thanks for joining me. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really great and an honor to be here on this podcast.
I'm very excited to have you, and you're one of my first guests, so that's even better.
Yeah, super exciting.
So I want to get into your whole history, your education in typography and everything, but I think to start off, I just want to ask you why you think type design and typography is important.
I think type design is important. I think, well, just generally type. I like to compare it to music a lot, and I think it's so attached to our understanding and our interaction with the world that it's just there everyday life, and a lot of people don't notice it, but it's core to how we kind of understand language and are able to communicate each other, at least on a written or visual format. And yeah, it's just super cool, and it ties in a lot with like history and culture and technology, and it's pervasive in our existence.
Yeah, I mean, as a graphic designer who uses typography, I've never designed a typeface myself, but I mean, that is the whole thing when you're choosing a font to go into your design, whatever that may be. The font is part of the visual communication, right? It's not just conveying the literal words, but it's like another layer of meaning, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think people can draw so much from type about like the mood or the vibe that you're trying to put off in your designs. And it can, in some cases, it could be like the core of your brand in a lot of places.
So then what drew you to type design? Why do you enjoy doing it, and how do you discover this? Because this is like a really specific niche in the graphic design world overall, right?
Yeah. That's what everybody says. It's like a super niche, super, I suppose, nerdy in some ways topic to get into. I think at least with a lot of people in craft design, they get introduced in it in school. So I got into it with at York YSDN with Paul Sitch, and he taught me at least in the course that we had. And then I moved on to taking some workshops, doing Type of Cooper, going to New York, and then working a little bit, then doing my master's. It kind of just goes on from there. You really have to be a little bit obsessed and a little bit crazy to really want to do type design. But it's just a lot of fun.
I mean, I studied at OCAD too, and I remember there you had to take typography courses, but there was an optional course for designing typefaces, and I had a few friends who did it, and they really loved it. And I have all the respect in the world for people who do that, because to me, designing a typeface seems really tedious. Like, it's so
Yeah,
many
for sure.
little details, and it's just like the alphabet, like so many glyphs. Like, there's how many glyphs do you typically design for one typeface if it's just like English?
I think if it's just English, um, usually like 500 is enough to get it by. But then if you start including like all the European languages and kind of Russian and stuff or Cyrillic, it can get up to like 1200, 1500 pretty easily. Yeah, at least with all the accents. So
It's a huge project.
it's also kind of where the fun is, surprisingly. But then you really have to like getting into like systems and a little bit of understanding kind of workflows and adjusting your workflow to be efficient. And that's also kind of part of why I enjoy type design.
So you have rules around, like, is it a rule around like the letter A and like then its various kind of forms, or is it more like my counters are like this, my terminals are like this, that kind of thing?
Well, that's more closer aligned to maybe how I would think about it. A lot of it is the systems are more in shapes. So you have certain curvatures that you like to keep for in terms of one typeface. So maybe like the 2 points and how they interact on the top of an A might be similar to how the 2 points on the bottom of an E might interact. Because if you're looking at like a stroke in calligraphy, it might be a similar kind of movement. And then once that expands, you can think of like all the different curvatures in a typeface and how they kind of are in the same system of um, strokes and curvatures, and it expands from there to the diacritics and all the accents in the different languages and scripts. yeah, I like to think of it a lot in systems. I think most people really, when they get into type design right away, they think it's really like an art, but it's very much more like an engineering project in some ways. I think I think I was drawn in just like everybody else. You see beautiful shapes and you kind of just want to replicate them. At least with type, like I there's another way of thinking of type that I like to describe to my students. It's like type design is like branding, but you're designing a letter. Like the brand is the typeface, and every letter is like a separate component of the brand that you're trying to put together. So it can, if you really like branding and you really like focusing on like the logo type or focusing on working in vectors, then it's like the perfect merge of interests, I suppose.
And how long does it roughly? I'm sure they're all a little bit different, but how long does it take you on average to design a typeface?
So the process of type design, when it comes to making a typeface, there's usually, if you're making it commercially for commercial sales or stuff, you usually want like a light or a bold on both ends, right? Like if you want like a light, extra light, regular, semi bold, bold. So you have a couple options that people can buy and use in their typesetting. And if you are doing that, then you want to make different masters, is what they're called. So they're kind of the keyframes, if you're to compare it to animation, of where your typeface on the axis lies. So if you have like a light and a bold and a regular with all the things in between, you're usually making two or three masters. Um, so it's like I have one extra light, I have one regular, and I have one bold, and then everything in between is kind of calculated mathematically using the interpolation stuff. Yeah, to make one master, it's usually about 3 to 4 weeks, I'd say, if you really want to get it really honed in. But with like all the diacritics for European coverage and stuff like that. Yeah, so a whole typeface could easily take like 3, 4 months, and if you're adding italics, it's another component that could add a lot of time to it. But it depends as well how complex the shapes are for sure.
I want to take a step back a little bit because I imagine most people watching this are designers, but just for anybody who isn't or is maybe only getting into the design field, can you explain what the difference is between the term typeface and the term font?
A font is usually, well, at least from what I remember, is usually just the description of what the metal um, uh, font is when you're actually using metal typesetting. But then now it's just been colloquially termed as like anything that is people think that is like, even people call lettering fonts. So it's kind of hard to adjust the general populace in understanding what the difference is. And then a typeface is kind of just a collective family, or like a collective collection of those fonts together, or typefaces. Like there's type families, and then there's typefaces as well. Um, but they're kind of interchangeable nowadays in some ways, the word typeface and a font. Um, yeah, I think we can go to like the historical definitions, but it's kind of pointless at this point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's neat that this is one little field, if you want to call it that, where the history has is like still very sort of present in a way. Like those are the terminology from when it was lead type on a big, huge machine and everything. And like even calling, businesses that design typefaces font foundries were like it was a foundry because you were casting like lead and metal. That was the foundry part, right? Of course you're not doing that anymore. Of course it's all computer now. But you still call it that, which I think is very cool, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean that's like a lot of, so much terminology in type design is very like archaic in a way, as well as like even like type anatomy and terminology in that way as well, and like all like the arms and ears and legs and stuff like that.
So we talked a little bit about how you discovered typography at York Sheridan, and what was the next step for you in your typography design journey?
So I went to a program called Type at Cooper Condensed, and it was at Cooper Union in the New York, in New York, and it was like this 5 month or 5 week, super intensive, like 9 to 9 kind of type design school, because it was a condensed program. They're trying to cram it all in these like 5 weeks. But that was super fun because I think I got to meet a lot of people who are equally interested in it, in at least the practice of making type. And I got introduced to a lot of concepts that I realize I'm still kind of referring to now. And it's yeah, it's just awesome program if you ever want to go. I think it motivated me to keep carrying on with learning about type because I think out of coming out of school, I didn't exactly know which direction I wanted to go into, and I was really interested in branding, but type kind of caught me just like from the side a little bit, and I got really obsessed with making fonts. And yeah, from that point on, I just really wanted to be a type designer and be involved in the type industry.
And did you have any idea at that point what the type industry like was?
Um, I like the thing is like this was about like 8 years ago, 10 years ago. Uh, I think it was just a lot of whatever you could find on the internet, right? I think the thing with Toronto is that it also there wasn't so many type designers in the city, right? Even in Canada at the time, I think there was like two or three, or maybe two, yeah, like two or three really like well-known type foundries, and then everybody else was kind of just like one man workshop or like sorry, one man studios that like doing freelance, so they don't really have any presence online. So you're just kind of trying to gauge what's going on. But luckily, after I got back from Type of Cooper, I contacted Patrick Griffin at Canada Type, and he hired me for a little bit, and we were working on type there. So I got some exposure to kind of what the industry is like and maybe what expectations I should be having if I were to keep going in the field. Yeah, so that was cool.
That's nice that you were able to come back to Toronto and get a job basically in type design right away. It's from the sounds of it. Like there's gonna be like five of those here, five jobs like that.
Yeah, yeah. There was a very small chance of me actually getting like work in Canada, and luckily Patrick was very generous in letting me work in the field because the thing about type design is like it's very hard to get a job simply because it's if people are taking you on, they're taking on your essentially your can I swear?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you're like your fuck ups because they have to essentially go over it again and redo it. It takes about the same amount of time to fix your problems as it takes for the person to do it properly. So, uh, yeah, it's just added on work if they ever take you on like that. So yeah, it's huge, very grateful.
I mean, I think to be fair, I think that's sorry to interrupt. I think that's the case with any especially junior designer, like or even intern, like you end up not redoing some of their work, or at least like they're a lot more work to help the junior do the work than like you might think. Um, that's just how it goes kind of at the beginning of your career.
But I think with type design, the studios are so small, it's usually just like one or two people, like most of the time. That kind of load is a lot more harder for people to take rather than like design studios who have maybe a couple more people and it makes sense to have an extra hand there. Um, yeah, it's a little different for sure in that kind of way, I think. Otherwise, I think I would have to go overseas, and even that's hard. Yeah, and I think the bar for getting into type design as an intern or as like a low level, like a entry level position is a lot higher, I think, because it's very so competitive. Um, yeah, you just have to be either get lucky and get hired really early, or kind of work on a lot of stuff by yourself and get to a point where people are interested in taking you on.
What do you think it was for you that made it like? How do you think you got that first job? Like pretty much right out of that program. Like, are you just incredibly talented, or is there something else going on
I don't know. I think it's a bit of luck, and I think I bothered him quite a bit to try to get some work, and he at the time, fortunately, he wanted to get some extra weights on a certain typeface, and that's kind of a job that fits more in the range of like an entry level job because you're kind of following somebody else's work, so you can kind of really have a good gauge of how you're doing. Um, and I think a part of it is you kind of have to have that ability to see, and that either comes with experience or if you're lucky, you kind of just have a certain ability to see those kind of discrepancies in the details. Um, and I think being through like Type at Cooper or some of the other programs where they teach you kind of the really formal introduction of how like type and calligraphy are kind of intertwined, you're able to see a lot more of the roots of where certain shapes should be and how your outlines should line up with kind of certain expectations. Like one of the coolest things for me when I first started working with Patrick was that he was able to, when he's doing critiques, he's looking at your work and he's like, move that like 3 points, move that 10 points, move this diagonal, just shift it down. This one goes down by 2, this one goes down by like 4. And then you do it and it works and you're like, whoa. Yeah, but just crazy. And that I think that was really like one of those things that I wanted that ability because I don't know why. It's just like a really cool um, thing that yeah that you just like you can fix shapes in your head and know how it fits on like this grid. Yeah, so that was super cool.
So you went to New York and did the Cooper program. Then you went back to Toronto and worked at Canada Type for a little while. And what was your next step after that?
So I really wanted to get into this master's program called Type in Media. And Type in Media is a really well-known, at least in the type design industry, a well-known master's program in the Netherlands at the KBK or KABK, or sorry, my Dutch. It's the Royal Academy of Art in the Netherlands. But it's a really hard program to get into. So I had to apply like 3 times. So I started applying about then, and then I didn't get in. So I was trying to look for jobs overseas, at least to try to get a little bit more experience and see what kind of like the European type design scene was like. So I applied for a job at the Northern Block, and I worked there for a year, and they were really great. We had a lot of fun doing with the projects. And yeah, I just kind of learned a bit more about the industry from like a different company and kind of see how other people do that, or at least work in type. Yeah, and I made Moray there, so that hit really big, and that was really cool to see. I still see that typeface everywhere. Um, yeah, and it's always a pleasure to kind of see your work at least out in the wild. So especially stuff that you might have made like at this point like 6 or 7 years ago.
Still has a life. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I know for sure. Yeah, it's one of I still see people use it on Adobe because it's you can use it there, and I think the thing with Adobe is once your typeface is on there, you kind of people just start using it because they have the subscriptions.
Right. Yeah. 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 That must be really traveling far. That is pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah.
And so Northern Type is that Canada or is that somewhere else?
The Northern Block is a foundry in the UK. It's in Newcastle upon Tyne. And I lived there a year with my girlfriend at the time. So we kind of moved. Oh yeah, that's why we moved. Yeah, so my girlfriend wanted to travel because she just finished school, and so I kind of just tagged. I asked her to go to the UK because we can both kind of find work there. Yeah, and that was fun. We traveled a lot that year and kind of bounced around Europe and yeah, got a lot of trips done.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
And was working there, especially compared to your experience in Canada, is it a very different environment there? Do the Europeans do things very differently than we do?
Well, like the thing I think what I found from my experience is that all these studios are so different. Because like for one, they're if it depends on the size. Once they're like a more formalized company, let's say, they usually try to get an office or like have some certain staff where you can kind of come in and work. But if you're dealing with kind of the smaller, more independent studios, it's like I was working in Patrick's basement and I would come in like like twice a week to go work in his basement for a couple hours and then I would go. And then Newcastle, I was working at home mostly and I would go into the office like once a week and we would have like crits and have chats and kind of do a round of work there. Yeah, and then you kind of hear different stories everywhere. A lot of places people work from home and they usually have like a couple days in the week where they're going to go in and have like a round of crits, or online even they'll just do video calls at least nowadays. Yeah, so it's I think it's very different for every studio you go to. I think it's just your approach, right? Every studio owner has their kind of different approach to how they want to achieve their goals. And I think with Patrick, he had a lot more time in the industry, and he already has like this base where he doesn't have to look super professional, if that makes any sense. I don't want to like, this is no downplay on anybody, but he already has the connections. He already has all like the clients coming back to him and kind of that kind of stuff. And I think at the time the Northern Block was trying to build that up a bit more, so they were trying to be a lot more serious about it. Yeah, and have like an office space and all that kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, it's just a different period of your company's life, I suppose.
Yeah. And so then what was the next step after the UK?
So I spent a year there, and then I kept applying for the type of media thing, and then I got in there. So it was 2019 to 2020. So I spent like half a year in the Netherlands until COVID hit. but but yeah, so my half year in the Netherlands was great, and I had so much fun with my classmates and playing like foosball in class because we have a foosball table in class, and maybe that's what everybody remembers about it. But yeah, it's super cool. I think they force you into thinking about shapes in a different way, and at least they try to impress upon you that type is can be different, I suppose. And so you get a lot of different outputs, at least at type of media that I've seen. It just has a lot of uh, flair and kind of personality that I think you can really see about the students. So that's also kind of why I really wanted to apply, because a lot of the other programs at the time were focused a lot on like text typefaces or kind of really serious type design, maybe we could call it, and like writing dissertations and stuff. And I'm not, I wasn't really interested in doing all the writing. So type of media felt like kind of the place I really wanted to be. Um, so I spent the half year there, and then COVID hit, and I kind of went home and did the rest of the program from like my parents' bedroom. Yeah, which was kind of sad and depressing. But I think it's COVID, right? What are you gonna do?
What you had to do, yeah.
It was cool to be able to do the program, but I don't think I got like the full experience because we also had like the grad show was kind of messed up with all the COVID stuff, and just people, you get a lot of huge drop in attendance because of COVID, right? Because that's just how it is. But yeah, it was cool, and I think with type of media is there's like it's one of those schools where if you mention it in the industry, people are like, "Oh, you went to that school? Yeah, I know." Like I know either people who've gone there, or I know the name, or I know kind of the reputation that it has. So I think that was kind of one of the bonuses too, and also having a master's so I can teach, because that was also kind of one of my interests starting out, just kind of being able to get to a place where I could teach a little bit.
So did you always think you were going to want to teach, or was it just this program that really made you decide, like, yeah, that's something I'm interested in?
I think well, this is another thing. I think when I was a little bit younger, I was looking at kind of the business models of people kind of starting out, and like a lot of people are teaching. a lot of a lot of people starting in the type design industry, if they're starting out with their own foundries, they end up with kind of like a teaching gig, so they can kind of hold out, because starting a foundry is kind of tough. um, so it really helps with that end. But I think it also, at least for me, yeah, I think I was interested in teaching. I could see, at least in when I was in type in media and type of Cooper, that I could communicate with people in a certain way about type that I think um, helps, and yeah, I guess is teaching, right? So yeah, I could see it work for me, and it was just like, yeah, why not? There's certain ways of thinking of type that can really help build you up in terms of having like a very strong foundation and having a ability to kind of compare what you're working on with maybe a reference that really helps. I think a lot of people go into type design not really thinking about references or thinking about things that they can have an objective metric to compare against. And so they kind of just make a lot of stuff that is really loose in concept. Um, and it can not exactly come together all the time. So I appreciate my education because it helps me with kind of understanding where the problems are and kind of how I can fix them and being able to spot those kind of things. Um, yeah, so the thing about like Type at Cooper and Type in Media is that it kind of draws from the same base. It's mostly by work by the guy who started the type of media program called Hera Norzai. It's kind of the Dutch, we might describe it nowadays like as kind of the Dutch thinking of type, where it's based on like the stroke. So you can kind of think of the stroke of a calligraphy pen as your base, and you kind of build on it with different details and kind of features. Yeah, it was really great for my foundation. And I think it extends to the way I teach as well.
That's very interesting, especially in like a very digital world where, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't imagine you or your students are hand lettering to start. I imagine it's all on the computer now, no?
Well, so the thing is, I've been trying to get my students to do a bit more of hand lettering to start because I want them to be able to want them to be able to understand where the shapes are coming from and that it's so tied into kind of how our body movements are and how our postures are, and maybe how our hand moves on a page, that certain shapes will come to form and be kind of ever present in our understanding of how certain shapes or certain letters should look. I think it has helped because I tried teaching a bit of it last year, and it flew over the students' heads. And this year I've adjusted a bit more of it into the hand lettering and really getting them to sketch it out and understand the fundamental reasons as to why certain letters have certain looks. And I think that's turned out a little bit better. I've had less question or maybe less sketches I feel dubious about. Yeah, so they're doing stuff that is looking pretty good, at least for the beginner. So that's great. Yeah, so we've been trying to get people doing a little bit of hand lettering, and I think it helps at least get because at OCAD, where I'm teaching at the moment, the type design course, we get it's a part of the general design, or I think it's general design section. So I get a lot of different students that aren't necessarily graphic design students. I get like illustration students. We have like digital media students and kind of a lot of different backgrounds. So I think a lot of people need a bit of help, at least with their relationship with type and understanding it from there. Because with graphic design students, a lot of people are already used to or familiar with fonts, so that at least they're looking at type a lot. And then other students coming in, they're not necessarily familiar with like calligraphy and fonts and all that stuff. So it's a bit more necessary to bring them up to speed before we start getting to the digital side, because the digital side is where I think people uh, can lose themselves really easily. And so try to slowly prep them before we throw them into the deep end a little bit.
When you say lose themselves, do you mean like they just assume the computer will like figure out a lot of it?
No, I think what I mean by lose themselves is people don't go in with a plan, so they don't with like a lot of like vectors and how we're moving the points. People start just moving points left and right without thinking about why, and they're just trying to like see with their eyes like, oh, this looks better, but they're not really thinking about why it looks better. So once you start working like that, then it's really easy to spend your time moving little dots around, even though it's kind of meaningless at the end because you don't really have a end goal as to why you're doing it. So yeah, that's maybe I'm trying to set them up so that they when they go into the design process, they have kind of a plan or at least reasons to change things rather than just basing it off of how they feel.
Yeah, so it is based on a rationale, a design rationale.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's in line with a lot of my design training in general. And I think a lot of people who haven't designed typefaces wouldn't necessarily think there's a rationale or a concept. You're just like, oh, you decided to do a serif or sans serif, and you got your strokes on this particular kind of weight pattern, and stuff like that, and then you just A B C D E, like easy, right? But it's actually a lot more nuanced than that, eh?
Yeah, I mean that's where kind of it goes back to having a system, because yeah, the rationale now kind of it's a visual rationale, right? Like you can't really you can write it down, but it would be really hard to write down. So you kind of have to have it visually and or at least mentally in your head. Um, and so once people you don't have that ability to put it on paper as to what you're trying to do, you really have to keep in mind what you're trying to do the whole time while you're working. Otherwise, you kind of start changing your concept or your how you're going about it. Yeah, so
I want to go back a little bit too to you getting your students to hand letter a little bit, just to help them understand how the forms kind of uh, how they kind of why they are the way that they are. So I think that's very interesting. If you look at the history of writing and just of letters and the alphabet, you go all the way back to cuneiform, where you had people using stone sticks to carve into clay, and so you really only had straight lines, and that was partly because the tools just didn't allow you to do like curves and stuff. Carving into tablets and stuff is very difficult, and you saw type design, or just type in letter forms evolve over the centuries, largely in part because of the tools that were available at the day, and then some other evolutions and stuff in some more context. And now we're in this digital age and have been for quite a while now, like I'd say 20 years at the very least. And type obviously has been digitized, even though we've spoken about how you still have this kind of older terminology being used. And I think, do you see, like, as far as how type is going to evolve in the future, do you think there will be a point where people aren't teaching kind of in the way that you are, where you're saying, okay, let's do some hand lettering first, so you get an idea of how stroke weight might change and stuff like that? Or do you think it'll evolve in like some really bananas ways with computer technology or stuff, or do you have any kind of vision for the future in that way?
I think at least with like the evolution of with it like you're totally right in saying that like type and the shapes that we see are kind of the result of this recursive loop of type and technology and kind of how they influence each other, and it carries on to now. I think at least with the shapes of type, I don't think it's going to change that much. And mostly because I like if you think of like type as music again, if we think of classical music and maybe a bit more classical fonts, like we're not going to change so much how they're going to be presented, or at least what our expectations of them are, and therefore you're not going to be changing them as much because you want to hit people certain expectations of what those fonts are, at least so that they have some familiarity with it. Um, and yeah, it could evolve slowly, like the way that capital is kind of turned into lowercase. We might have a certain shape that we start recognizing a bit more as a certain letter down the line. But I think type is it's kind of ever present, and it's always gonna be kind of the same process, I would say. Um, at least with fonts that I personally like. But then on the other hand, there's a lot of like decorative stuff that comes out of this access to technology and being able to try out a lot of different shapes really quickly and kind of do a lot of prototyping with the digital medium that we might not have been able to do before. That like has an influence on that side of things. But I think with the text portion of type, it's not going to change so much. Um, yeah, but with the more decorative elements or maybe a bit more complex designs, there's a lot of room for play there, and I think that's like art and like design. It's that's kind of where you can kind of play with all that kind of stuff.
I mean, now that I think about it too, the fact that everything is so digitized, like we don't write by hand as much as we used to. Like, we don't send letters, that kind of thing. Never mind like sign painting.
Yeah, that's kind of I was trying to figure out how many of my students could do cursive. And I learned very quickly that not so many of them have very nice cursive, so it's kind of hard for me to teach certain concepts of like calligraphy and lettering to them if they can't really write well. So I think that's going to be a challenge coming, at least in a couple years. But I think they also reinstated cursive teaching in elementary schools here. Yeah, like 2 3 years ago maybe. So we'll see. But I think yeah, it's totally fair that people have a lot less connection with kind of the roots of how we make letters, and it's just going to be different. I don't think it's necessarily going to be bad, but I think it's, as long as they keep in mind what came before, I think it'll be okay.
That's good. Yeah, I think it's interesting because since the layman isn't handwriting stuff anymore, literally, like we don't, again, don't write letters and that kind of stuff. Because I'm thinking about the history of the evolution, the more recent evolution of the ampersand, how it was, the French word for and they kind of got smushed together over time. Then you got a few variations on it. That wouldn't have happened if people didn't write by hand, right?
I think the reason why that was so possible back in the day is because there were um, established tastemakers, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think with like a global design industry, there's a lot less um, like you can't really make for the globe because everybody has different what they like different expectations of what they want and what they want to get out of it. But I think at the time there's only a couple people making fonts, and if there's like three foundries in your country, that this is the only place you can get it from, then everybody's going to start using the ampersand because it's available in their fonts. Um, and so that becomes a lot more easy for you to kind of influence the industry that way. Whereas nowadays it's like you have to convince like 2,000 type designers to add a certain glyph to it to make it like pervasive in our design vocabulary. So that's kind of a lot more difficult, right?
Well, let's talk about some of the top fonts that you've designed as Manic Type. Right now, you have 8 fonts on offer. Right now, is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah. And there's quite a variety. You have some really unique, different kinds of shapes, and like you've really kind of run the gamut. It feels in you don't have like 5 different serif fonts, whatever. You have some really interesting decorative or display faces.
So I try to add a lot of texture to the world with my fonts. At least that's how I like to think of it. Kind of thinking of type as like a tool, and being able to give people a tool that kind of fits somewhere in between like different typefaces that they were trying to get. And so give people a different flavor, a different voice for their brands and stuff like that. I try to be at least give people a new flavor, because there's so much type out there that is kind of like also like classical music. They kind of sound the same if you're not really paying attention. So we're trying to be a bit more interesting, and give people options with what they can use, provide some utility and stuff like that.
Then I'm interested though in a typeface like your face suds, which is like very decorative, very very unique. It's just based off of like bubbles, basically, right?
Yeah, so with suds, I was trying to find a way to make a typeface that kind of had a little swirly curls in them, and it started turning into this really bubbly bubble letter graffiti um, kind of inspired typeface. And that was a really fun project to work on because it was relatively quick, I think.
What's quick for you though?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I used a plugin called Letter Ink. I think it's called Letter Ink, and it helps you make all the curvatures for kind of the lines if you're trying to do a noodle of a line. It can help with that. So I was using that to make that, and that was really kind of quick to set up because I could just sketch out kind of what I think the letter could come up with, and then kind of put it all together.
Have you seen it used in the wild?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Oh, actually, no. I did see somebody use it for packaging on weed, so that's
Oh,
cool.
nice.
Yeah,
I for sure thought you
yeah.
were gonna say soap, and I was like, okay, that's cool.
No, yeah. Got the other way, but that's still cool for me. So I came back from Type and Media, and I also went back to Canada Type for a little bit, to do some work there. And then after a year, about a year there, I started my foundry, Manic Type.
And what made you feel like you were ready for it at that moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that the thing is, when I first started doing type design out of school, it felt so um, accessible as a business opportunity in terms of like, yeah, I can just make this font at home and then sell it online. And then all I got to do is contact like my fonts or somebody and get a publisher to be willing to publish it. And I think that still holds true. But I held off on it for a couple of reasons. And I think it was just mainly because I felt that there were so many aspects of the type design process that I wasn't really too familiar with just yet. And I wanted to make sure that I kind of knew everything before I like started getting into it, or at least my idea of what everything could be. So after like the couple years I was working and doing the master's program, I felt like I had a certain level of competence, at least with type design, on the design and the font production kind of side of things, that I could try to make a foundry and try to sell my own fonts. And it was kind of like a long term play for being able to have like your own royalties and all that kind of stuff. Because a lot of the foundries, if you're hired as an employee, you don't really see a lot of that coming back, and that's just how it is. I think it makes a lot of sense. Um, so starting my foundry was, I'm young. I have some level of energy in me to make a foundry. So let's do it. Yeah.
But it sounded like you were pretty optimistic about running a foundry from the business side. You were like, yeah, I'll design a font, like, 6 months easy, and then I'll put it on, feature fonts or
Yeah.
what have you, and then there you go, money in the bank. Like,
Yeah. I mean, you think that, but then I don't know. There's a certain level of like you can make fonts and you can sell it, and I think that's really how you want to start getting into it, is having your fonts accessible to users so that they can use it and then come back to you for more work if they think your type of fonts are good. Because if you don't like post your work or sell your work, then there's nothing for people to look at, and then nothing for them to want to go back to. So it's important to kind of get yourself out there in that way, especially if you're starting out in type design. Um, because otherwise you're just working at home on a font and nobody's using it. And I think another thing about starting foundries is like you can usually start, if you really wanted to, with like one font, but I think most people just want to have like at least a small library of fonts that people can kind of try, because it showcases a lot of maybe different attributes about your work, or different design considerations that you as a designer take into account, that you might not be able to get out from just one font. So being able to have like two, three options is great. It's like just like a portfolio, right? Like if you only have one project, that's all they can see, right? If you have a couple more, then they have the ability to gauge kind of your ability to play with different styles, kind of your different understanding of different moods or vibes, and based off that.
so then you've been running this foundry for a couple of years now. If you don't mind talking about the business of it a little bit, how has it been going?
It's not simple at all. I think yeah, these past 2 years have been a bit of a challenge. I think it makes sense though. I kind of expected it. So with the type design industry, at least if you're a type foundry, or maybe even if you just want to call yourself a type foundry and you're one dude like me, hello. It can be kind of separated into different couple income streams, let's say, with at least just the design work. So there's like the commercial side of sales. So you sell your fonts that you're making for the commercial world, and they can kind of buy your fonts and license it that way. And then there's the other aspect of it, which is more like the freelance custom side of type design, where you're making fonts for clients or making kind of different lettering pieces for people, for them to use wherever they're using it. Yeah, so there's kind of those two streams of income. Yeah, and I think you really have to be able to find your market. I think it also, this is another reason why I compare it to music, is it's also kind of like the music industry. If you think about it in a certain way, you can get really quote unquote lucky obviously your work is good, but if it gets picked up by the mainstream, then you get really fortunate in that way that people really want to use your fonts and um, kind of get in that way. And then there's the other side of things where people are making commercial pieces of music like jingles and stuff. So that's kind of like a similar um, maybe comparison to that kind of stuff. And then on the other side, maybe somebody really big wants you to write a song for them so that they can use at some event somewhere. So the same way you might have somebody um, really big name like McDonald's or Starbucks or whoever who wants to use a certain typeface for their campaign. So they'll contact you and make you do a custom typeface for them that way.
Have you been getting a bunch of those jobs?
Ooh, no, not really. I think that's the other thing about starting these studios. It's you either have to know a lot of designers that who will land those jobs and be able to connect you that way, or you have to have a certain reputation where people are comfortable giving you that kind of work because you have showcased that you're able to do that kind of work. I think it makes sense. It's just kind of the same thing with design as well. Mostly been doing commercial typeface releases and getting kind of income that way, which really depends on who's buying and licensing your fonts. And if you, again, like if you have the larger clients want to license your fonts is usually where the income comes in, less so from the individual purchases. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. It's just the amount of exposure and the licensing fees that come with having somebody with reputation use your work.
And something that's always sort of not confused me, but I've always wondered about this for any type foundry. Fonts are obviously digital files, they're digital products. I have a bunch of fonts that I'm not gonna lie, I did not pay for. And I would, buy a license if I used them professionally for client, of course. But I obviously, as a designer, I want all these fonts at my disposal so I can test them out in my own work and then figure out what works, right? And I can appreciate that for all founders, big and small. Um, you're not having the work stolen per se, but it's being traded around and you're not being paid for it. And that just seems like a very tricky, it seems very hard to run a business when your product is so stealable.
Yeah, I think that just comes with the territory of anything digital, like even music. People torrent music and movies and games and everything. So I think it's par for the course, maybe. Just people who aren't going to pay for it aren't going to pay for it. And if they really are wanting to be above board with everything that they're doing and be ethical, they're going to purchase the font and use it for the the commercial purpose that it was intended to be used for. Yeah, if you're not licensing the font, you either don't have enough exposure where you're going to get caught, or you don't really care enough to be paying for it, which is usually not a huge project. I totally get it. I think it, like, especially as a student, let's be honest, everybody is a student. You get those like torrent packs of like 200, 500 fonts, and you just dump it in your font drive. Um, I think, yeah, it makes some. I don't want to condone it, but it's it's just, I think, expected. There's a lot of foundries nowadays offering discounted fonts for like personal use, like heavily discounted. It's usually like 80, 90%. So you can use it for schoolwork or proposals and all that kind of stuff, especially if you're like a freelancer, um, one person studio or student even. There, there's a lot of foundries offering discounts in that kind of way, having a personal license compared to a commercial license.
Yeah, and I think in those cases too, those fonts, they don't come with all the glyphs, all the characters.
Depends on the foundries. Like for my foundry, I do offer the whole typeface. It's just for personal use, but I do offer the whole thing because you can download the trials as well and get the limited glyph sets. But it depends on what you're feeling. That's another thing about the type design industry is that nothing's standardized and everything's just based off of what the person who is owning the typefaces or the foundry wants to do with their licensing. And I think that's maybe one of the bigger issues that a lot of designers and people buying fonts have problems with is that not all of the licensing is clear and and the same, which yeah, you just have to really pay attention to your typefaces when you're using them and know what the licensing conditions are. So that I know that's a big bother with everybody.
It can be really confusing. I've bought fonts for client projects, and then like complete the project, everything's approved. The client wants to buy the typeface, and that's great. And then we're looking at the licensing, and it's like, okay, what license do we need to buy? Because sometimes it's about how many computers this is going to be installed on, and I'm like, okay, I don't for the future. I don't know. I don't know what my client's going to do. And again, fonts can be shared so easily. Like you just really can't kind of understand that. And then it's like, does it count if it's used in like public like design work, like advertising that goes out in the world, or is somebody just going to use this font in like a PowerPoint presentation internally? Do you need a license for that kind of usage, right? And then like it's hard for me to understand as a designer. It's harder for me to like, to explain to my clients who like really don't understand. Like, why can't I just use it like I can, Arial or whatever?
So nowadays, with the licensing, people are trying out different models with the pricing. So you might have seen people sell them as like enterprise style licensing or like company size licensing or stuff like that, where all of the usage is kind of tied into one license. It's just based off of how big your company is, which is what I offer on my site, which I think is a lot more inviting to smaller studios and small businesses. It makes it a lot easier for them to not have to worry about like all of those factors of like where I'm using it. Am I using it on web? Am I using it on print? I'll need a desktop license for that. I'll need a web license. I'll need an EPUB license. I'll need like it gets a bit crazy. So people are trying out that model, and I think it's within at least within the last like 3 4 years, it's become a bit more popular, and people can try to see if that is maybe what you want to use. And then on the other side, I try to offer my typefaces on Type Network with the more traditional model of like desktop and web and that kind of model of pricing or licensing, because I think that still gives people the ability to access it that way. If you're a larger corporation, that it makes more sense for you to get it that way. You can get it that way. So I try to have both options, at least for my customers, because I think it just opens it up a little bit more. Yeah, but it can get very, very confusing and really hard to keep track of.
Well, and then people buy the license from you, and I've purchased one of your phones, but in my own experience, you usually have to fill out a form and say I'm using it for this and that, or I work with this company and whatnot. But you can't really keep track of what happened, how it gets disseminated after
Yeah, that's like so much extra paperwork. I totally get it from a customer side of like the point of it is like the licensing is especially if you're using like four different fonts from different companies, or you gotta everybody has a different license, and they maybe have one word that's different, and that just means you can't use it here, you have to use it there. And if you're not paying attention, it's so easy to not follow the license, and it's yeah, just easy to lose track. So we try to have a little bit of both, right? At least with the newer style licenses of being it all encompassed in one. You just have to make sure that it corresponds to how many employees you have or how many people are working at the company. Um, yeah, so that it makes more sense for people who without a legal team to double check all your work, to be able to produce things without having the worry of offending some license.
What about in cases where you use a typeface as kind of a starting point for designing some kind of logo or word mark, but like then the designer customizes a bit, and customization could be like they're changing shapes entirely, or they're just like tweaking the spacing. Maybe they, throw in a ligature themselves or something to that effect. Like when I worked at Indigo years ago, and the logo for Indigo is based off of Franklin Gothic, but it is very much tweaked to be their logo precisely, but you can tell the letter forms aren't massively changed. So in a case like that, you buy the kind of font once, or is there like a special kind of payment situation or licensing situation if you want to use it in that way?
So here's the other thing is like some foundries will say you can't use it in a logo. You have to come back to us for a specific license to be able to use it in a logo. I don't do that because I think it's kind of effed up if you're selling a design product and you're not able to use it in a logo. It's just kind of a little bit backwards. But if you do purchase a normal license, most of the time you're able to edit it in like Illustrator or something, but you're not able to edit the original font file. And that's where the restrictions are usually, is that you're not able to change the original font file, but you can tweak whatever you want outside of that because it's not going to be able to be used as a font, right? There's another like thing I like to describe type design as like being a monk. Like everybody's trying to pursue their own definition of like what a perfect letter structure and their forms are. And so you're always like on this singular path of working by yourself and refining and being able to overcome the adversity of the process. And then everybody else is doing the same thing if they're a type designer. I don't know. I mean, the designers too, but like if they're a type designer, then everybody's like suffering in the same way, and you can't really help each other as much as you think because the process is so dependent on your ability as a single person. You can hand it off, but then that just turns into somebody else designing the font. It's not necessarily like it carries on with you. Like they might take your design and then they'll work on it and adjust it, and they may see other things that are wrong with it. But then it's your design, but it's not really your design at the end because there's so many inputs that go into it. Um, so it can be very much like you're just like a monk and meditating on and type and shapes the whole time, which is kind of fun and kind of crazy, and it's it'd be a little weird.
Well, I mean, I think the analogy is really apt, but the other thing that it sounds like to me is that it's very isolating. You're already in a very small, like niche, a small community, and then it is really kind of individualistic work, and also the nature of this industry. There aren't a lot of big companies for you to work at, and that kind of thing. So, I mean, how do you find it isolating, and what's the community like? Are you able to participate in the community of type design here, or?
I think in Canada it's tough. We don't really have so much of a type design community, and I've been thinking about it for years to kind of start something, but I just live in Scarborough, man. It's so tough to get downtown. I think if it is kind of isolating for sure, because I do run my foundry myself, and I'm like the only guy who works, right? So I just work on it by myself. I definitely have a network of people online that I can talk to about my work if I wanted to. Um, it's there. I think the other thing about getting into type is being able to get into those networks, and knowing where to find the people to discuss type with, no matter where you are. I think starting out, especially if you're a student or in Canada or in Toronto, it's very hard to have that community and that base to kind of raise you up and help you focus on what you need to focus on. You kind of just have to find your own way a little bit. But overseas, like New York or the Netherlands, Amsterdam, like Porto, there's a couple, like London, there's a couple hubs of type that kind of were established based off of historical kind of just this is where the base of design and type was, and it's where the foundries were, and this is where all that community is. We don't really have that as much in Canada. We're kind of just we're a little bit newer in that sense. We had foundries, but we're not really that big either. And yeah, most people kind of keep to themselves and maybe a bit more here compared to New York or something where they have a association where that hosts a lot of these programs that they can kind of attend. With the type stuff, it's a lot less accessible here in Toronto. Um, yeah. So, but I still have people I chat with online and communities there. It's just different, and I do want to try something maybe in Toronto. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, definitely let me know if you do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think you're definitely the right person to help us along with and get that going. Yeah, so maybe we'll have a little chat after this podcast about it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, I do run Swash and Serif annually. A bit of a break with COVID, but it's back. It came back this past summer. That's a typography show, typography and lettering, and it's been ever since I started it in 2014. It's just kind of grown year over year as I think more people come to be familiar with the show and whatnot. And I mean, an art show for designers is a pretty rare thing. That just isn't really something you do in the design world. And then for typography, and particularly, and we do have a mix of different kinds of people to participate in. You have graphic designers, you have letterers, typographers, but illustrators, fine artists, and stuff. I don't discriminate too hard on that. I just want the work to be really good. There's so many different people doing a lot of different kinds of things here with lettering and type. Especially if you look at the lettering and the calligraphy space, there's quite a lot of people doing kind
Oh
of.
yeah, I know. There's a lot more lettering and calligraphy people in Toronto than there are type design people, which I've noticed as well. I think there was XYZ type a long time ago. I, I think they haven't really been running as many events, but they were definitely one of those like communities that I was like, oh, this is available in Toronto. But it's not. I think the other thing is maybe um, in Toronto it feels more sporadic than it does maybe elsewhere where they have like weekly or monthly get-togethers about type and stuff like that. There's less of a built-up community that way. There's like workshops and classes you can attend and all that, and that's amazing to even have in the first place. Um, but in the sense of having an established culture and of type and people having a space to go explore that interest in a way that's not necessarily in a classroom setting is great if it's there, which I know it hasn't been the case for a while.
Yeah, well, everything was paused for a little bit there. But when you're talking about those communities, especially, I imagine you're thinking of some stuff that you've seen in New York and abroad. The people who are participating, do you find they're people who who make their work in these fields? So like designers, working designers, but also people who want to maybe who do typeface design or art professionals basically, or do you have people who are a little bit more like this is fun, this is cute, I'm going to try this for a little bit kind of thing?
the the things I'm thinking about are um, like there's Type Thursday, which is I think it's been around for a couple of years, and they have a bunch of different branches. Um, I thought about starting a branch, but they wanted royalties that were kind of crazy. But they'll that yeah. So what they do is like they have a monthly thing where maybe 3 or 4 people go on stage to have their work presented, and then they have critiques in a setting with different professionals that work in type and design, and they can kind of discuss different aspects of their work and how to improve it on that from that perspective. And then there's also like other smaller conferences maybe where like people are doing presentations and they can have kind of a discussion afterwards with people doing uh, critiques and stuff and having a look at work and having that atmosphere of like a constructive type atmosphere where people can kind of come in and have their work looked at, have a discussion about it, and maybe learn a bit more about the craft that way rather than having to take classes and exploring it in like such a tight time frame where it doesn't make so much sense for everybody.
I've been thinking for a long time about workshops and other kinds, classes or whatever, something like that, where people can have their work critiqued. Because I think critique is so valuable. But I also know it's hard on people sometimes. It's hard to have your work critiqued even
Sure.
if you want it. And I was just like, I don't know what kind of pull I would really, or what kind of draw I would really get to an event where it's just like, hey, let's bring your work and we'll critique it, which can sometimes mean tearing it apart. We'll be nice about it, but it'll still be hard to hear. I'm just wondering, will I get a good turnout if I do something like that?
I think you would. I just think people have to get over it. I mean I've told this to my students too is like if you're a designer you have to have an opinion. If you don't have an opinion you're pretty much useless because especially in like a team setting. Because yeah, you can do great work, but if you're not going to be able to contribute to other people and your team in a way that people can understand what you're talking about and work on it constructively, then it's kind of like sure you're just like freelance on the side. There's not so much team building that is available there, and being able to have concise and constructive criticism on work can be a very helpful thing in terms of building your own understanding of work because you're able to dial in on what the problems are as you work on your own stuff. Um, yeah, I think that's also why teaching is great, because you can practice that ability all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I've done a little bit of teaching, and I definitely appreciated how, because I had to explain myself to my students.
Yeah.
It really makes you like think about like, why do I think this? Because maybe you learned it at some point. Now it's just like just something you know in the background, like why a design should be the way that it is or something, and then you have to really put words to it. Yeah, you learn a lot from teaching yourself. It's really interesting.
Especially in those like community critique sessions, I feel like people can get different things from it that you might not necessarily learn in a classroom all the time, or maybe you don't have access to a classroom that you can go to learn how to talk about work and learn how to describe what you're seeing, or maybe learn where the references that you like come from, that maybe you would have that kind of input from that kind of setting where you usually wouldn't at home.
For sure. I think being challenged is really important. Having to like really think about why do I think it should be this way? Because you're right. Like we all have, various influences, and you may not always realize that you have an influence or a bias or what have you. But being asked just to explain why, you know, like it's a very good thing.
And if the why is I like it like that, that's fine. I think that's totally fine. I think a lot of people always feel like they have to have this beautiful answer, constructed answer of why they did a certain thing in a design. I think it's okay to say I like it like that, because but then we have to adjust our design and concept to maybe um, helping that thing that you like along, and you can still do that, but we have to know that whether or not it fits into what you're doing. Um, if it adds to it, sure, but if it confuses or adds a lot of uh, messaging that doesn't really fit, then maybe we have to adjust it. And maybe what you like doesn't fit, but you can like it. It doesn't matter whether or not you like it. It's just whether or not it fits the purpose of what you're trying to do.
I think that's well put. So I think we're about at time here.
Wow, that flew by.
It's been a fantastic conversation. I could go for a lot longer, but I want to give you some of your day back. But I think just like let's wrap it up here with we talked about your kind of journey towards where you are now, where you're running your own foundry, Manic Type. What do you see for the future for yourself?
Hopefully we can get some of those clients to want to work with me and on slightly bigger projects. And I think I just want to keep teaching and doing type. I think it's such an amazing practice, and I love it. It's really interesting to me, and it really uh, hits on a lot of the interests that I have. So hopefully I get to do that for a long time. I'll be at Manic Type for a while, hopefully, and we'll see how it goes.
Well, that's great. I wish you all the success. I think what you're doing right now is really fantastic. I
Thank you
encourage
so
anyone
much.
watching this to, yeah, go check it out. It's manictype .com, I believe. Is it .ca?
Yeah.
.com. Yeah.
And I also have some stuff on Type Network, Future Fonts, and Adobe as well. Yeah, so we just got some stuff on Adobe recently.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks again so much for chatting with me. I hope we'll run into each other at some point if you can make it out of Scarborough.
Yeah, I know it's not that far, but when it comes to, I don't know, it's just like the drive
Yeah, for sure.
and parking, and it's,
Well,
yeah.
I know. I went to high school in Scarborough and I grew up in the East End. So I live in the West now, but like I'm familiar. I know. But yeah, I hope we get to connect at some point and we'll keep chatting about typography and community and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, we'll see how that goes. Maybe you guys will hear something about it later down the line. Thank you so much for having me on, Margot.
All right. Thanks so much, Jamie.